Audism in Healthcare. Hi, my name's Ellie, and I'm the founder and CEO of Deaf Hub Bendigo. We're so proud to be partnering with Auslan Consultancy to produce this documentary focusing on the experiences of deaf and hard of hearing people living in rural and remote settings. We were keen to compare the levels of access and equity experienced by regional deaf and hard of hearing people when compared with their hearing peers. After conducting video interviews, it soon became obvious that this group experienced huge disadvantage when interacting with the healthcare system. This included access to health information, access to interpreters, and informed consent. We followed two individuals who shared their experiences to help highlight these issues.
Hi, my name's Grace Rourke.
Hi, I'm Emma. Again, there was no interpreter, so Mum had to step in. I was advocating for my right to know everything that was going on with Mum, but they just refused. Now, let's hear from Grace. She tells us the story of her experience in hospital while she was pregnant with her child. I remember back when I was 16, I became extremely ill and was sent to hospital with pancreatitis. The hospital had an on-call system, so Mum and I presented to the emergency department. I can't say that I remember the whole thing very well. Well, I was terribly sick at the time, but what I do remember was that Mum was very stressed. She was forced to switch between being a concerned mum and looking after a sick daughter, and also interpreting everything that the doctors were saying so that I could be informed. Whether that meant giving permission for procedures, medication, or just to try and work out what was wrong. The hospital said that they'd booked an interpreter, but they never came. So it was up to Mum to be on call to interpret for my entire stay, which lasted a week. This kind of thing always happens at hospitals. Another time 2 years ago, I had my tonsils removed. Once again, there was no interpreter, so Mum had to step in. The hospital originally refused to let Mum into the pre-op room, where I was to sign consent forms and have the procedure explained to me. Well, you'd expect an interpreter to be there, explaining what was going on, right up until you go under and enter the theatre. But because the only person I had to interpret for me was my mum, they wouldn't let her in. I finally managed to convince them to let Mum come with me as far as the theatre door. Well, legally you have the right to communication up until the anaesthetic kicks in, but they refused to provide an interpreter. That's right, they said that nobody was available, that they weren't coming. Looking back, I don't think I even bothered chasing it up. I thought, well, it's just my tonsils, even though it was kind of a big operation, but no, I didn't have access. There was another time after that I needed to have a general anaesthetic for some tests that I was having done. Well, this time there was an interpreter, from start to finish. They were allowed in the theatre with me and were able to relay everything that was happening, what the medical staff were saying, what medications would be used, everything. I remember seeing them signing right up until I went under, and when I woke, they were there. But when I had my tonsils removed, I really had to advocate for them to allow Mum in. I said, you haven't provided an interpreter, but I still need to know what's going on. So they eventually let her as far as the theatre door, but not into where I was to have the anaesthetic. I panicked quite a lot because all the doctors were talking unintelligibly around me until one of them put an oxygen mask on my face and I was put to sleep. That's awful. Yeah, there's so much room for improvement in the health system. Doctors' appointments are much the same. Living out here in a regional area, there's just not enough interpreters. I've had to cancel so many appointments because there wasn't an interpreter. Sometimes I don't even bother cancelling, and I'll try my luck with the pen and paper. It takes longer, and sometimes the communication breaks down. Maybe I'm tired that day, or I can't think of the right word to write. Then the doctor doesn't understand me and misinterprets what I'm trying to say. Do you think that things have changed with interpreters since the rollout of the NDIS? Definitely. I feel more independent. I don't need to rely on my sister or my mum or beg a friend to come and interpret for me in exchange for a coffee or shout them breakfast or something. I don't need to do that anymore. And now, I can book interpreters online. I can decide who I want and who I don't want to interpret for me. It's great. Being independent means I have flexibility and peace of mind when attending appointments. I don't have to worry about whether or not there's an interpreter in my area. Today, technology has come so far, and we've seen the growth of video relay interpreting services. Yet we were curious to understand how successful these services are for those living regionally. I had an ultrasound appointment and there were no interpreters available. With no other option, my partner and I decided to try using a video remote interpreter. It was really tricky though, because I was lying on the bed, the radiologist was on my right, and my partner, well, he should have been on my left, but then I wouldn't be able to see the interpreter on the screen. So my partner had to stand at the end of the bed with the phone in his hand, where the interpreter would usually stand. Well, the tiny screen moved around and was hard to see, but also the interpreter and the technician, they couldn't hear each other clearly, even with the volume all the way up, which meant some parts of the conversation got missed. So, with the phone to his chest, your partner couldn't see the interpreter. That's right. Standing at the end of the bed, we couldn't both see the interpreter at the same time. We both would have preferred a face-to-face interpreter so that we could say what we wanted to say and communicate with the radiologist. And how would you say that COVID has had an impact? Well, when it comes to interpreters, it's had a massive impact. Mask regulations too, particularly when seeing a doctor. They're quite risk-adverse and can be pretty inflexible when it comes to mask wearing. Without an interpreter, if someone won't remove their mask and I can't see their face properly, I can't communicate. It can be really exhausting having to advocate just to be understood. It was a very trying time. Now, let's hear from Emma. Emma and her mother had an extremely close relationship, and she shares with us her experience of her mother's cancer diagnosis and then of her passing. Emma talks to us about her family and her journey to gather information about her mother's diagnosis. I argued a lot with my family because I was fighting for my rights. I wanted to know everything that was going on with Mum, and they just refused. They didn't want me to know the full story, and I said, you know what? She's my mum and I need to know. Mum was such an important person in my life and we were extremely close. She was my best friend and we did so much together. So I insisted that the doctor tell me absolutely everything. All of the details from A all the way to Z. I was finally able to make that happen, and I remember sitting at the hospital and my sister, well, she wasn't happy. Well, bad luck, I thought, because I was going to keep advocating to get all the information that I could. The doctor explained what was happening, and I knew that it didn't matter if I cried. I mean, of course you would. Who wouldn't in that situation? I had a support person who was interpreting for me, and finally the situation was clearly explained. I understood more about Mum's illness, her situation, and what was going on for her. Mum had said that she wanted me to know what was happening, so I told her that I would make that happen, and I did. And were you shocked hearing all of this from the doctor? Oh yeah, big time. I actually didn't realize that lung cancer was as severe as it is, but it has such a terrible effect on someone. I came home and cried, and my sister said to me, "Why'd you have to ask the doctor all of those questions?" And I replied, "Because I need to know. I'm a part of this family too." And my dad, well, he said nothing. It made me feel so frustrated. Did you know that your mum was dying? I mean, from the start? Well, no. I always thought that she'd be alright. I mean, she was on medication and she was doing okay. But when I asked the doctor about her doing chemo, he said that she wasn't well enough. She continued taking the medication, but it didn't work. There were side effects, but still no improvements. She stayed stable for a while, but then the doctor told us that she wasn't getting any better, and he said that she wouldn't recover. That feeling, no words can explain it. So, how long was that process? I mean, from your family finding out that your mum was sick to you learning that she would pass. How long did that all take? Well, my family, they'd known all of this since April. But being deaf, I'm always the last person to know everything, and it's the same old story. It wasn't until about halfway through it all that I was finally brought up to speed. But they'd known all of this the whole time. I guess they thought that they didn't have time to explain it to me. So, during your mum's time in hospital, were you ever provided with any access to information so that you could know what was going on? Not really, no. I should have, but I didn't think they'd even provide an interpreter. I did have a support person with me right up until Mum passed away. I really felt like I needed that support, so they were with me quite a lot. She was able to ask the doctors and nurses what was happening and then translate it into Auslan. So although she was great, it still wasn't adequate access. It just wasn't good enough. So why didn't the hospital provide an interpreter? Well, I don't know. To be honest, I was having a really hard time, and I couldn't stop thinking about Mum. The last thing I was thinking about was arranging interpreters. All I could think about was her and us spending time together, not interpreters. It appears not uncommon that people living regionally are forced to go without interpreters. But has it always been like this? Now we'll meet Michael. Michael is a teacher of the deaf and an interpreter who moved to Bendigo back in 1981. Let's find out what changes he's seen in that time.
It goes right back to when I first came to Bendigo in 1981. There were no interpreting services in Bendigo. None, and there was no deaf society in Bendigo. So most deaf people just didn't bother about having interpreters because they couldn't access interpreters. I don't know how they survived. Most of them would take a family member with them to interpret for them.
Well, as we can see, not much has changed. While Emma did know that her mother had cancer, its severity was never explained to her, and she believed that the diagnosis was mild. Not until much later did she find out the seriousness of the situation, despite the rest of her family being fully aware. Well, it all happened very quickly. I found out in April, and then she passed in July. So yeah, it was very quick. And how has her passing had an effect on your life? Well, when she passed away, I really struggled. I was so angry. I screamed and I couldn't stop crying. I fought with my family and I pushed people away. I was just so angry. When it came to the funeral, well, I refused to go. Eventually my family said that I had to, because if I didn't, I would regret it. So Emma nearly didn't go to her own mother's funeral, until fortunately her family convinced her. It really is a heartbreaking story of a mother and a daughter who were so close and their time spent talking and spending time together tragically cut too short. Hospitals are required to provide interpreting services. This would have allowed for Emma to have access to communication and information about her mother's illness. In contrast, her family was privy to much information, while Emma was told nothing. Now we'll meet Innocent, who relocated to Australia from South Africa. Innocent first arrived as a refugee, and he shared with us his experience of arriving into the country and being examined for mandatory health checks before being allowed to live in the broader Australian community. Refugee health checks require vaccinations, and it was very interesting to discover what had happened in Innocence's case. Let's take a look. When I first arrived, I had to go and see a doctor. Coming from South Africa, they have to make sure that you're inoculated and not at risk of bringing diseases from overseas. They want to keep people safe, so I went to see a doctor at the refugee centre. They gave me a checkup, and then they started giving me these injections. There was an interpreter there, but I really couldn't make out what they were signing. Even though they knew some international sign, I still couldn't completely understand them. I'd love to ask you, you said the hospital did provide an interpreter, but how much of what they were saying did you understand? Well, not much. I ask because in Australia the law is quite clear. Legislation says that before anybody receives any kind of vaccination, they must provide informed consent. That means that whether through an interpreter or not, you have to have the process fully explained to you. Do you think that happened in your situation? Well, I nodded along, but no, I didn't fully understand. And do you think that the doctor realised this and just gave you the injection anyway? Or did they keep trying to explain things? Well, they just kept writing things in written English, and I kept saying, you need to get an interpreter. Language was a huge barrier, and I got really confused. Sunraysia Mallee Ethnic Council, well, they wouldn't book an interpreter. They didn't understand that it was their responsibility to provide one, or what a deaf person might need. So I was very lost. I didn't know what was happening most of the time. It was like they'd never seen a deaf person before. They just kept trying to write in English, but I couldn't understand. It wasn't until they'd sent me to an audiologist to have my hearing checked that they finally understood that I'd grown up profoundly deaf. Up until that point, they weren't sure. You mean they didn't believe that you were deaf? Well, that's right. I now have the audiologist report at home, but with so much on my plate, I was confused. It's not like I hadn't tried to explain it to them, though. I tried to explain it many times. I wanted to know what was going on, and I needed an interpreter to relay what was happening in a visual way, so that I could understand, and so that I could express my needs too. With an interpreter, I have access. I can communicate, and I can be included. But without one, I can't understand what's happening, and I feel depressed. When I first arrived, the doctors, well, they treated me like I could hear. It wasn't until much later that I'd shown the doctor the audiologist report. It was then that they finally understood that I'm completely deaf. Up until that point, they thought that I could hear. They just didn't get it. Finally, they figured it out. So, was the injection a one-off? No, I had to have multiple injections. Oh, you had more than one? That's right, I continued taking a full course of the injections. And were you ever told what the vaccine contained? Well, they kept writing to me in written English, but that's not accessible to me, so no. Innocent's story is truly shocking. Coming to Australia as a refugee and being forced to receive vaccinations without any access to communication, you have to wonder, what would have happened if he was allergic to some of the vaccine's ingredients? Any newly arrived refugee would face language barriers. However, that matter becomes compounded when that person is deaf. Innocent's story is a clear example of a complete breach of human rights. I'm left to wonder about other refugees who aren't deaf yet still face barriers in communication. How similar are their experiences? Throughout the course of these interviews, however, it's become increasingly clear that these barriers are made drastically worse when that person is deaf or hard of hearing. It's time that our community says enough is enough. We have the right to access interpreters and the right to access health information. Now, let's hear some more from Michael.
So a lot of country deaf people grew up used to having no interpreting. They just accepted that was the way that it is. We don't get to have interpreters. Mum will tell us. And there are still some older deaf people today whose mum and dad, who are in their 80s, are still taking them to the doctor and doing all the talking and then telling them about it later. That still happens in rural areas.
So why is this still happening?
Because that child has grown up in an era where there was no interpreting. Mum and dad don't know anything about interpreting. They don't know how to book an interpreter. The deaf person accepts this is just the way that it is, and so they don't bother. And it's been an effort here for us to encourage deaf adults to put their hand up and say, I want an interpreter, it's my right. And they'll say, oh no, it doesn't matter, my granddaughter can do it for me, or my sister can do it for me, or mum will take me, I'm all right. That's an attitude that's entrenched in some deaf people because they've never had that that ability or that knowledge that interpreting is a right, it's not a privilege. So.
And do you think that the shortage of interpreters and difficulty in booking one leads people to just not bother? So what are your thoughts after hearing the stories shared with us today about even young adults still relying on family members to interpret for them, even in surgical settings? It seems that the hospitals can't be bothered to book an interpreter or simply don't know how.
Yes, you're right. But in fact, what they don't know and what hospitals don't know is that it's illegal. It's illegal to have a family member interpret for you if that family member is not a qualified interpreter. Okay, there have been some court cases over this issue, I believe, that if a surgeon or a doctor at the hospital touches a deaf person or does an operation without an interpreter, they can be sued for assault. If that deaf person does not understand what is happening, if there is no interpreting, so the deaf person doesn't know what's happening, you can be charged with assault.
It's critical that people understand that they have the right to access a qualified interpreter when they visit a hospital, as even the slightest translation error can lead to a truly terrible hospital experience. Let's hear some more from Michael.
When I was at Bendigo Senior, one of my female students was playing football with the boys, and the football came down and just hit her on the finger, and her finger broke there and there. It was like a figure Z. And she was rushed off to hospital, of course. I couldn't go with her because I was at the school interpreting. Her family didn't think an interpreter was necessary, and I got a call from the hospital 2 days later to say, please come, she is crying hysterically. And I came down and said, what's the matter? And they said, The girl said to me, they're going to cut my finger off. So we called the doctors in, what's going on? And what had happened was that 2 doctors had come in to have a look at the finger. It was in plaster. And they said to each other, that plaster looks too tight. We're going to have to cut it off. And they got her hand and they said, yeah, we'll just cut it off around here, take it off and then replace it. And she thought they were going to cut the finger off, not the plaster. That's one story.
As we can see, trauma can easily occur in a health setting without access to complete information. In the absence of an interpreter, it's easy for the message to get lost, and one small mistake can lead to long-lasting trauma and a loss of trust. I'd love to take us back now to Grace's story, where she goes on to explain what happened during the pregnancy and after the birth of her baby. This time, an interpreter was provided. However, as we'll see, things can still go awry. From what I can remember, I was in labour for about 8 hours, and I'd had 1 epidural. Then they offered me a top-up. Looking back, the first mistake was that they didn't bring the interpreter in at that time. There was 1 interpreter on site, but they were on a break. At that moment, it didn't matter. I wanted to get on with it and get the top up then and there, and I didn't want to wait. The doctor really should have brought the interpreter in anyway, but that didn't happen. So I had the second epidural, but what went wrong was that the person who performed the top-up was a different person than the one who'd administered the initial dose, and they didn't actually read my medical records properly. They didn't realise I'd already had a full dose, and instead of giving me a partial top-up, they administered another full epidural. Not only that, but they accidentally inserted the instrument too far into my spinal cord. I remember the moment really well. It was like someone had stabbed a knife into my back. I'll never forget that feeling. It was just so awful. As soon as the instrument was taken out, I could feel that something was wrong. Mum was there, and I told her that something didn't feel right. She told me not to move because I'd been sitting up when this had happened and had started to jump forward. I kept saying, something's wrong, something's wrong. My mum, my sister, my partner, the nurse were in the room, and I said I needed to lay down. I could just feel that something wasn't right. My legs felt really strange and started to tingle. If anyone touched them, they felt awful. It was really weird. I really shouldn't have been able to feel my legs after the epidural, but I could. The doctors agreed to lay me down, and that's when I blacked out. I don't remember a thing after that until I woke up in the ICU. It was so strange, waking up in this white-walled room. So the baby had been born at this stage? Yes, he'd been born. But you had no recollection of anything up until that point? Well, no, I'd actually died. From what people told me, I was awake and I looked over at my sister. Then I closed my eyes and it looked like I'd fallen asleep. They called a code blue and medical staff came rushing in. Doctors started administering CPR and I actually died for 4 minutes. That was because I'd been overdosed with the epidural and my spinal cord had been punctured. So I was dead for 4 minutes, but the CPR managed to bring me back. Then they rushed me to surgery to have an emergency cesarean. But in the elevator on the way to the theatre, I died again. I'd gone into cardiac arrest, had a heart attack, and my lungs had collapsed. I died in the lift for another 3 minutes, so all up I was dead for 7 minutes. After that they performed the cesarean, the baby was born, they took him away, and then they took me to the ICU where I was in a medically induced coma for 5 or 6 hours. So I woke up in this white room, and the first thing I remember seeing from my bed was lots of white walls. The blinds were closed and there was a big wide open door, and to the right of that was a whiteboard. In blue pen, someone had written, "A bouncing baby boy." As soon as I saw that, I reached down to touch my stomach and I was speechless. I was awake and alert, but I couldn't bring my hands to sign. I just kept feeling my stomach. Mum was there, and when she realised I'd woken up, she rushed over to comfort me. I had this big tube in my mouth, so I couldn't speak either, which was really disorientating. I didn't know what the fuck was going on. I kept touching my belly and wondering where my baby was. Mum went and got the nurse, who got me to cough so they could remove the tube from my mouth. Straight away I asked, "Where's my baby?" Mum said, "Don't worry, he's beautiful," and pulled out her phone to show me a photo. I took the phone and looked at this photo of a baby. He was being kept in the NICU. Mum wanted to talk to me, but all I could think about was my baby. Last thing I remembered was having this huge pregnant belly, but when I woke up in the ICU, it was flat. What the fuck had happened? I was swearing my head off, saying, "What the fuck happened? Where's my fucking baby? What the fuck is going on?" Then Mum tried to calm me down and tell me that everything was fine, but no one would tell me what had happened. "So, you're saying that you'd been dead and then unconscious while they'd performed the cesarean, and you didn't get to meet your baby until 10 hours later?" "Yeah, that's right. It is what it is, I suppose. I feel like the hospital robbed me of that experience. I always imagined I'd give birth and be able to hold my baby straight away, not 10 hours later. When I was finally able to meet him, I couldn't believe that he was mine. I kept asking, "Is he really my baby?" and kept being told that he was. So I had a bit of a breakdown. He had to stay overnight in the NICU because of low blood sugar, and I had to cope with him not being with me. I'd only been able to meet him for about an hour, a half hour maybe. I was completely exhausted. They took me to my room and my partner and I slept. The next day they brought River in and we stayed there for a week. "And River is your first child, right?" "That's right." "I'd love to know, what did you imagine that the birth would be like? I mean, during the pregnancy?" "Well, I always thought that I'd give birth naturally and be able to hold my baby straight away, just like anybody else. I imagined there'd be an interpreter there, my mum, my partner, but yeah." "And I suppose you were looking forward to that?" "Well, yeah, of course I was looking forward to meeting him. I had a really good pregnancy and I felt that we'd bonded. Each appointment at the hospital had been a good experience. The staff would make adjustments for me and they always made sure there was an interpreter. Everything had been going great until it all went into chaos." "And it's important that you have an interpreter for the epidural, yes?" "Of course." "Well, why is that?" "Well, it's important that the process is clearly explained to me, step by step. I'd assumed that it would be a relatively quick process, but it actually takes quite a while. They have to set up a lot of equipment, check that I'm okay, and record accurate medical records. Mum and the interpreter were there for the first one." "So after that, did the interpreter just leave?" "No, she stayed at the hospital, but she'd been with us in the room for quite a while, so she left for a 5 or 10 minute break. That was about 11 o'clock, 11:15 maybe that she took the break. Then they administered the top-up around 11:20. "So why didn't they bring the interpreter back in for the second epidural?" From what I can remember, they did ask me if I wanted to wait for the interpreter to finish their break or if I wanted to go ahead with the top-up. My sister and my mum must have interpreted that part for me. At that point, I didn't care. I was in a world of pain and I just wanted it done. Looking back, I really should have insisted that they went and got the interpreter. "You said before that you felt something was wrong when they had administered the top-up. Was it your mum that you said that to?" "That's right. Mum was in front of me. I remember I was leaning forward and holding on, and everything seemed normal at that point. Then when the needle went in, I felt a sharp pain and I jumped forward. It was like a deep pinch in my spine. The nurse tried to keep me from moving because I know that it's possible the procedure might not work or you can mess it up if you move around. I remember verbalizing that something wasn't right and I looked up at Mum. She said it's alright and not to move, but I said, "No, something's wrong. Mum then told this to the medical team, and I said, yeah, something's wrong. I can feel it in my body. I suddenly could feel this sense of doom, and I could feel that my body was just slowly shutting down. I just knew straight away that something wasn't right. I signed that to Mum, and then my sister came straight over. So when your mum explained things to you, was it clear, or did her emotion get in the way? Do you think that if the interpreter was in her place, it would have made a difference? I think that the interpreter might have been a bit more assertive on my behalf. My mum did used to work as an interpreter, but I've noticed that with me, I don't mean this to sound bad, but she's a bit out of practice. So when she voices for me, it's different to how another interpreter might do it. I think that if the interpreter was in her place, they would have noticed how serious I was and conveyed the urgency of what I was saying loud and clear. That's one thing. Maybe that could have made a difference. So would you say that you never really gave informed consent to the procedure? For the first epidural, yes, but definitely not the second one. So tell me, when you regained consciousness, what was that experience like? I was so confused. I didn't know I had no idea what was happening. I felt like I was back to the old Grace. I was alert and I felt like myself again, but everyone was acting so strange and no one would tell me where my baby was or what had happened. The last thing I remembered was having a big pregnant belly. It was very confusing and I felt pretty angry, wondering where my baby was. So what was it like developing a relationship with your son? At the start, it was hard. Like I'd said earlier, I'd had a great pregnancy and we'd bonded. Of course, every pregnancy has its ups and downs, but all in all, I'd enjoyed that time. Once he was born, he was just taken from me. It took about 4 weeks for that connection. It wasn't until he started smiling that I really felt that I had love for him. I mean, of course, I always did, but after the bond we'd had when he was in my belly, to him being taken away, it was different. Different to that immediate bond that other mothers feel. That was robbed from me. There was a sense of detachment waking up without him. It was like our connection had been cut. It took a while, but I've worked through it. So how has this all affected your mental health? Well, I still need a lot of support. I haven't even been able to really see anyone yet though, because I'm too focused on making sure that everyone else around me is okay. My partner, mum, my sister, even the interpreter are all traumatized. They saw the whole thing unfold. They nearly lost me. Witnessing me actually die, well, I've been focusing on them, I guess. It's only really been the last couple of months that I've realized that I need help. So I'm getting the ball rolling now. So I wanted to ask, before all of this, what size family did you imagine you'd have? I'd always wanted 3 or 4 children. And now? 1. I mean, I'd love to have a second or a third, but what if it happens again? My partner feels the same. He would rather not have any more. We both come from big families and talked a lot during the pregnancy about more kids, but now, well, no. I mean, maybe we'll change our minds in the future, but that's a big maybe. Of course I'd love to, but I can't ignore that voice in my head saying, what if it happens again? And I don't want to leave my partner to raise 2 kids alone. So we're just happy with what we have now and enjoying our son's presence. Is there anything else you'd like to say to the hospitals or to other parents out there? Well, when it comes to deaf parents specifically, always make sure you have an interpreter. Even if the deaf person says they don't need one, it's worth having one just in case. And it mightn't just be the mother who needs one. the partner could also need an interpreter. Actually, that's something I forgot to mention. While all of this was happening, my partner was asleep, and it was so strange. I tried to get his attention, but he was sleeping, so I looked over at my sister instead. Just then, as I lost consciousness, my partner, he woke up. He said he'd had a strange feeling that something was wrong, and he opened his eyes to see people rushing into the room and his pregnant girlfriend passed out on the bed. Well, at that point, my mum and my sister were fussing around and they kind of forgot about my partner. The interpreter had heard them call Code Blue through the PA system, and she knew straight away that something was happening to me. It kind of seemed that everyone that day knew what was happening except for me. Anyway, the interpreter rushed in and went straight over to my partner. She could see that my mum and my sister, they had each other, but my partner, he didn't have anybody. He was sitting there with his head in his hands, so the interpreter actually knelt on the ground to relay what was happening. Then the doctor said that if they had to, he needed to ask, should they save me or should they save the baby? And my partner said, "Save Grace, save Grace." Well, my mum made sure that his voice was heard and that his wishes were clearly expressed to the medical team. So I'd say that it's crucial to provide interpreters, not just for mums, but for anyone, especially in situations like mine. During our travels, we heard so many people's stories, and I can't help but feel that as deaf people, we face such extreme disadvantage. Access in general is far from equal. We're living now in 2022, so why does it feel like we're still living in the 1500s? We have uncovered many similar stories, and what we've found is that these experiences aren't limited to just healthcare settings. Our other stories expose barriers faced in education, employment, relationships, and many other avenues of life. So, I want to ask you a question. Who is accountable? Is it deaf organisations to advocate for our rights? Is it the wider hearing community making adjustments or legislative change? Who's listening to us? How can we work together to make change? You and me, collectively pushing forward. We are all responsible.